皆様お待たせいたしました。
Thank you very much for waiting. We will resume the International Symposium towards year 2030 and beyond, which is sponsored by JREF. The topic of discussion 3 is a future perspective of electricity market, ideal way of unbundling and market integration. We have from Fuji Research Institute, a research fellow, Mr. Hiroshi Takahashi, and Institute for Applied Ecology research coordinator, Felix Mates. And we also have Thomas Corberrier, who is the executive board chair of JREF. And today, at the end of the day, we have a roundtable discussion involving Mr. Naoki Inose, Vice Governor of Tokyo, and Masayoshi Son, founder chairperson of JREF. And the topic of this roundtable discussion will be how can we boost a competitive electricity market in Japan. And we shall be closing at 5:15 in the afternoon. So we will start the discussion session. Discussion 3 is titled Future Perspective of Electricity Market, Ideal Way of Unbundling and Market Integration. As moderator of this session, we have from Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies, Executive Director, Mr. Tetsunari Ida. So, Mr. Ida, will you please carry on? Well, thank you very much for your introduction. I am Ida from ICEP. And so in this session, we are going to be looking at the future of the electricity market. And so we'll be looking at the unbundling of power generation and transmission, and also looking at the market of using renewable energy. And so this unbundling issue and also liberalization of the market have been topics of discussion for the past 10 years or so. However, they have never been linked together in a single discussion. And some people might say that providing an expensive power and also having a feed-in tariff system was contradictory to each other. But we felt that maybe there was not sufficient understanding of the feed-in tariff system. And we just installed this method or system in this year, and it is with the feed-in tariff system that we'll be able to promote the renewable energy for power generation. And we'll also be having discussions in the future of the unbundling of our market. And so we would have to look at the direction in which we should be proceeding. Now, in Germany, they are already in the second stage of the introduction of the feed-in tariff system. In Sweden, unlike Germany, they have been making good use of the RPS method. And in either way, they have now gone on to a liberalized market where they are able to integrate renewable energies. And so we believe that there is a lot to be learned from the experience of these countries. So first, I'd like to call upon Dr. Felix Mates from the Institute of Applied Ecology. Now, some people in Japan might say that the feed-in tariff system had been a failure in Germany, but maybe we'll be able to learn from him as to the current status of the use of the FIT system and what will be the next stage.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and the kind invitation. I am always honored to be here because of several reasons. One of the reasons is that the parallels between Germany and Japan go much beyond the usual expectation. We start from the same share of nuclear energy. Both countries are or have been, in the case of Germany, more skeptic about liberalization. And last but not least, both countries are countries where corporatism, that means a special mixture between policy and the private sector, has a long tradition. I would like to highlight some of the recent debates on market liberalization and the transition towards renewables, which has changed significantly the political planning in my country during the last 2 years. You have seen this in the morning. That is the set of energy policy and climate policy targets which guide energy and climate policies, or which shall guide energy and climate policies during the next couple of years and during the next 3 to 4 decades. We have very ambitious targets on greenhouse gas emission reductions. You see 80 to 95% by the mid of the century. There's the target to go through a transition towards a more or less completely renewable energy-based electricity system, and we have the nuclear phase-out by the year 2022. And you can see from this set of targets that this is an integrated package of climate and energy policy. And within this package, the decarbonization of the power sector, the transition of the power sector towards renewable energies is one of the key elements, or some say it's the core of the great transition which are we envisaging. We made some progress. This is a screenshot from my iPhone from this morning. There you can download every morning the projection or the prognosis for renewable power generation. And you can see here from this screenshot from this morning that the 6th of September in 2012 will be an interesting day with a lot of solar power in the system, a low wind day. But anyway, at noon, at least at noon in German and Berlin time, a renewable share, mainly in this case solar energy, will represent 40% of the electricity. And you can see 2 issues from this. The first is renewable energy start to dominate the system, at least at noon, and we have very, very different situations with all the variable energy sources. Today, it's a day which will be dominated by solar production. There are other days where you have a big yellow bar and a big blue bar, where the combination of wind and solar dominates the system, and you have other days where we have a lot of wind during the night. This is the more longer projection. You can see there that we made significant progress during the last 20 years. We have seen last year power generation from renewables, which is an equivalent to 20% of the overall electricity production. We will see probably a few percentage points more this year. Might be that we see 25% this year. That has to do with a very windy year and with the expansion of the solar energy in this country. You can also see from this graph that we have a legally binding target within the framework of the European Union to expand power generation from renewables to 35 to 40% by 2020, and we have the national target. That means at least 80% by the year 2050, which is an equivalent of about or significantly more than half of the power production in 2030. What I tried to indicate in this graph that we are at the moment at the turn of a certain market design, of a certain approach to deal with renewables. You have seen from my iPhone screenshot that we are coming to a situation where renewables dominate the system. And in this situation, the question arises if the successful model of renewable energy support, the feed-in tariff system, must be complemented or on the longer term substituted by a more broader approach, which is a more broader approach with regard to market integration, and the second is a more broader approach in terms of system integration, in other words, in terms of infrastructure. And you can see here that the properties of the German feed-in tariff system, which was financial support, obligation for network connection, and the priority network access, have to be complemented by other elements of market design and infrastructure upgrades. And at least in 2020, we will see, or we see the need for a much stronger European integration. So we had, during the phase where renewable energy was representing a share of less than 20%, a very successful scheme, which was based on fixed and long-term feed-in tariffs based on costs, an obligation for connection to the existing network, and the priority access to the network and the market. And if you have a look to the experiences with this feed-in tariff, then we have a mixed experience. The first is if you have a look on the specific costs of wind or others, then that has been pretty interesting in terms of cost, much cheaper than the renewables obligation certificate system in the United Kingdom. On the other hand, we have huge cost, high costs, especially because of the PV, which represents half of the payments for renewable energies at the moment, whilst 12% of the supported electric power comes from PV. But the collateral benefit from this was that at least the German ratepayer has brought down the cost for PV. Again, you should bear in mind that 10 years ago, in the year 2000, the kilowatt hour from PV cost about €1. The recent feed-in tariff for PV in Germany, which will be less than 20 euro cent per kilowatt hour in the end of the year. And that is a cost reduction of about 80% over a decade. And frankly or honestly, the German ratepayers have made this possible and have made this technology available at this cost to the world. However, we need to think about broader approaches. The first is when renewables will start to dominate the system, we have to think about the electricity market and market integration, which is dominated by a source which has short-term marginal cost of about zero, is a challenge. The second property of the liberalized European market is that there is no case for long-term contracts for a bigger market share, and we have at the moment no capacity markets or capacity payments. And the point is, and that is the discussion in Germany for this year and for the next couple of years, how we reform today's power markets to a more appropriate structure, and how we reform the support scheme. That means bringing in market price signals into the existing support scheme for renewables. The second, and that will be my key issue for this presentation, is we envisage an era, a period, where we can't exploit only the existing infrastructure any longer. We face a period where a massive upgrading of transmission and distribution networks is necessary, and significant investments will have to go there. Secondly, we need unbiased network operators for the planning process with regard to the necessary long-term investments and within the network operations. You have heard this morning in a presentation that we will need a 20 billion investment in the transmission system. That looks like a big number, but if you look back to the decades before the turn of the century, 2 billion a year was the business as usual. And the problem is that after liberalization, we are just in the end of a decade of record low investments into the infrastructure. And the key issue was how to build an enabling framework for these infrastructure investments, which are more or less business as usual if you compare these with the investments in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s of the last century. The third issue is that, and we had not that much experience with this, that you need an independent regulator with a clear mandate who creates an enabling framework for the infrastructure investments and which avoids the abuse of market power from infrastructure monopolies. Because I think that is an important point. There is, in the world of vertically integrated utilities, a lot of rents for those who can or are be able to exploit congestions, market power in the generation sector, etc., etc. I will continue with some aspects of the infrastructure integration, and I will leave beside the market design issue, although this is also a very, very important point. And frankly, coming from a country which has not a very great record on liberalization, we are just benefiting in the German debate with regard to the renewables from some stranded benefits from the EU liberalization. As you know, the European Union started in the mid of the last decade of the last century an effort to liberalize the markets. We went through 3 liberalization packages in 96, in 2003, and in 2009. And one of the key features of these liberalization packages was an increasing intensity of unbundling. We have started the unbundling of generation, of sales, and especially of the grids in 96, mostly with functional unbundling and unbundling by accounting. And after we made a lot of very, very difficult and nasty experiences that you need a much stricter unbundling to have unbiased network operators and to go for real neutral network operators, these requirements have been tightened. That means at the moment in the European Union, you have more or less no alternative for the transmission networks to go for ownership unbundling, and we have increasing requirements also in terms of unbundling of the distribution networks, at least for those network operators which supply more than 100,000 customers. And I think that is an interesting point of the third liberalization package, that we have introduced a high standard of medium-term network planning with a huge degree of participation. What does it mean? What did this mean for Germany? We started in the end of the last decade with 4 major vertically integrated utilities, which covered generation, transmission, distribution, and sales, RWE, E.ON, Vattenfall, and EnBW. And we had several hundred regional and municipal vertically integrated utilities. After all these unbundling, we are in a different world. First, we have separate entities for generation and sales. And these entities for generations and sales have no longer any strong ties to the transmission system. We have 2 of the big companies which are fully ownership unbundled. There's one where only a quarter of the shares is held by the former parent company, and we have only one, that's the smallest one, which is not yet ownership unbundled. And we have the larger share of the larger distribution companies also unbundled. What does that mean? The interesting case was the German industry and the German utilities have always objected intensively and radically against any mandatory unbundling provisions when the respective EU legislation was under discussion. Ironically, immediately after legislation has passed, they mostly went beyond the minimum requirements for unbundling because they have seen very clear, if there is a clear direction on this, then they gave up their objections very quickly. What has changed in terms of energy policy planning? We have much more unbiased activities. The network companies are a more accepted and a more reliable partner for policy, because policy has to assume that the network operators will represent interests of market-dominating generation companies. We have significantly more investments in network infrastructure simply because of the fact that investing in infrastructure is the only business case for these network companies. In the former vertically integrated world, they always had the choice to allocate their investment resources. And at least during the decade after the turn of the century, all these decisions have always been made in favor of generation investments. And that is one of the underlying reasons why we are at the moment at the end of a decade of extremely or record low investment in infrastructure, and that was not longer in a sustainable situation for a system which shall be or will be and is be transformed towards renewables which are more infrastructure intensive than other sources. And the third issue is that the network companies became a key player on the medium and long-term infrastructure planning. We just are in the end of the first year of an infrastructure development plan with a broad consultation which my country has never seen before, and that has only been possible because the public accepted that there is an entity which is interested in infrastructure and which has not vested or hidden interests in other forms of generation. Anyway, that has been possible because of the unbundling. But the second success factor, or the enabling factor, has been that we set up with the Bundesnetzagentur, which is a German regulator, a very strong and a very effective new regulatory body, which has a clear mandate to safeguard the infrastructure investments and to maintain the transition towards renewables. These are the results of the most recent network development plan, and you can see here the key challenge for the German transition of the electricity system. Many of the cost-effective and cheap renewable energy resources will be in the north. The main centers of demand in Germany are in the south, and so we have to go for a new structure, a structure of new DC lines which connect the future centers of production in the north with today's and the future centers of consumption in the south. And this kind of planning and this type of investment is only possible and has only been considered seriously after the interests of the network operators were separated from the interests of their former generation sisters. Some lessons learned. The German success story from 5% to 20% of renewables and the total electricity supply is without any doubt a result of the feed-in tariff scheme, which provided an interesting framework for financing for network connection and dispatch. It has been the primary instrument. It has been the primary instrument because it delivered a robust financing framework, and it has enabled the connection to the existing framework. However, we are entering a new phase. We need a more complex financing for renewables and other instruments. That has not been my issue today, but we also have to create market structures which are more appropriate. And I think you have to consider that we are facing a totally different world. We are coming from the horizontal world, base load, medium load, peak load. And we are entering a world which is much more vertically. High share of wind, low share of wind, high share of solar, low share of solar, high consumption, low consumption, high imports, low imports, high gas, low gas, etc., etc. And the only way to coordinate this is to create market signals, to organize the market coordination by market signals, and there you need a certain structure. The third issue is that we have to create an infrastructure industry which is supportive for infrastructure upgrades and rollout, and which builds an institutional framework for these major investments, which has in self-interest in infrastructure investments and in connection of renewables to the grid, because that is the exclusive business case for them. If they have other business cases, then it will be much more difficult. And the far-reaching ownership unbundling has been effective, at least in our framework. The last point, and that's my last lesson learned, one of the enabling factors for all these is the creation of an effective regulatory body, because it is about the oversight on infrastructure monopolies, and monopolies tend to do nasty things. So you have to go for an effective oversight. And the second is, in the longer term, if we want to go from the 20% to the 35%, to the 60%, to the 80%, to the 90%, you need an effective planning institution for major infrastructure upgrades and rollout, and also for safeguarding the reliability and the security of supply. We made a lot of experiences with this. Not all of these experiences has been successful, but especially the interaction between the liberalization of the market and the longer-term transition offers a lot of space and offers a lot of synergies and offers a lot of infrastructures and mechanisms which are indispensable for this great transition which we are going for in my country, in Germany, which is not that difficult from yours. Thank you very much.
Felix, どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Dr. Felix Mathis. For both PV, I know that the rate is 80% or so, and mega solar, there's about 13 coming on stream, and also, as was mentioned, as you saw on the photograph that was indicated on Felix's iPhone. So the variability of renewables can be fully accommodated in the market system. And there are many operators, generators in the market who are doing well. Now, I'd like to call upon Mr. Thomas Caballel, who used to be the Director General for the Energy Agency in Sweden, and he is currently the Executive Board Chairperson of Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. Thomas, please.
Thank you very much. I will talk now based on my experience not as Director General of the Energy Agency, which I was for the 3 out of the 4 last years, but actually from my experience as a member of the Swedish Government Energy Commission in the mid-1990s that finally proposed that the Swedish electricity market should be re-regulated so as to introduce full competition between all producers of electricity on a government-controlled transmission grid. In those days, Sweden was one of the pioneering countries in introducing open competition for electricity. And the re-regulation process was rather complicated, and there were many, especially the large power companies, who disliked the idea of having their regional monopolies disturbed. The most important success factor in the Swedish re-regulation process was that the motto, the leading ideal for those of us who were involved in the re-regulation process was to keep everything simple. Keep everything as simple as ever possible. One could say it would get complicated enough anyway, but we must try hard to keep it simple. One reason, of course, being that with all the very large economic vested interests involved in the process, it was indeed a difficult and important task for those of us involved to avoid being unduly influenced by those economic interests and instead be able to favor what was to be the public good, the real value to society of the reform. The fundamental idea of an electricity market with competition is that you separate the task of distributing electricity, of transporting the electricity from the producer to the consumer on the one hand, and the task of producing electricity on the other. Some companies compete for producing, another, often a state-controlled monopoly, operates the distribution. It's like many other markets where there are producers and consumers and public roads and highways and railways to use to distribute the goods from the producers to the consumers. The important criteria for an electricity system to function is that you feed in as much electricity at every moment as you take out. There must be a balance in the electricity grid. That is the technical criteria for an electricity system to work, and it's also the fundamental component of regulation of an electricity market. Everyone was to be free to buy or sell electricity. The only criteria to be allowed to connect to the national transmission grid and put in or take out electricity is that you have a contract with someone else. If you're a producer, you have a contract with a consumer. He's allowed to take out electricity. You say you will put in electricity, and one of you have to be responsible to ensure that you are putting in as much electricity as the consumer takes out, so there's always balance. And if you do not manage to get absolute balance, you will be charged afterwards for the cost of your failure to balance production and consumption. You must measure what you put in and what the consumer take out, and the national transmission company is checking afterwards that you have complied to the balance requirement and will charge you if you fail. It doesn't have to be more difficult than that, but as you understand, there is a lot of electric meters to check and calculations to make, but it's fully possible to do. The role of the independent transmission companies, as I said, is to measure and ensure that there is balance. An important reason why this must be an independent actor from all the power producers is that the controller of the transmission system should treat all producers in the same way. They should each have equal rights of access and to distribute their electricity to the consumers. And if you're an owner of a power plant, you cannot be trusted to manage the distribution system in a fair and equal way. Another extremely important task, as Felix also mentioned, is to make investments in increased transmission capacity. Such investments are important for the value of individual power plants. If you own a power plant in an area where there is a deficit of electricity production capacity, prices will be higher there than in another region where there is more surplus of electricity production capacity. And owning a power plant where power is scarce, you do not want investments in a grid connecting that area to a low-price surplus area. So if you are the person involved in any investment decision, you will try to stop such investments. Owners of power plants cannot be trusted to make the most societally beneficial investments. This must be done by an independent actor. And finally, a very important task of the transmission system operator who controls the actual power flows in the system is to provide information to all. And together with the organizers of the spot market and electricity market in the Nordic countries, this has been very well achieved. Anyone today can go in and look at the electricity production, consumption, the flows between different areas, and the exact prices every hour of the day on a website that is available to all. Some of you might think that is not particularly interesting, but I assure you that in policy making on energy issues, when power companies control this information, they can manipulate the way they present it to politicians and to the public and get the decisions through that they prefer. But with such information publicly available to all, the public as well as politicians can take more well-informed and rational decisions. And in addition, of course, anyone who considers making investments in electricity generation will know what the value of electricity at different moments in time in different areas are, and therefore will be able to make more rational decisions. Well, the organization of the market, as I mentioned, also involves a marketplace, a spot market, where producers and consumers or companies that provide electricity to sell electricity to households every day make bids, how much they're willing to pay for electricity or how much they require to be paid for producing electricity. And you get electricity prices varying every hour through the coming 24 hours. Once again, data that is immediately publicly available to anyone. And then in the short term, real-time control of the market, the transmission system operator will ask for further or less electricity depending on the balance, and afterwards charge those who have the balance responsibility for the different contracts that are in operation. After 15 years, this has proven to work rather well. We do get prices that vary in time and between different parts of Northern Europe, also in space, depending on bottlenecks and varying availability of wind energy, for example. But it has provided the opportunity not only for efficient investments, where investments might be the best way of keeping prices at the right level, but of course also of adjustment of consumption. When consumers know what the price is for electricity every hour, they can adjust their consumption, reduce their cost, and become more competitive. Something that many industries in the Nordic countries are now using so as to reduce their electricity cost and improve their ability to compete on the world market, whatever they produce. When this reform and the idea of a competitive electricity market was introduced, many people, even in the Swedish power industry, said this was ridiculous, it was impossible, it wouldn't work, there would be blackouts, they would lose money, and there were a lot of technical arguments that you didn't really know whose electrons you were buying and a lot of other things. But quite quickly, it was still introduced, and it has proven to work very well. During this period, some of the larger power companies that existed before have merged, but a lot of new actors have become active. Municipalities have built cogeneration plants providing district heating and producing electricity for the electricity market, and many new private companies have appeared building wind power plants providing electricity to the Swedish and Nordic electricity market. Competition has meant that prices have stayed low. And unlike Germany and Japan, we don't have a feed-in tariff system, but rather a system of renewable energy portfolio standards or quotas and competition among suppliers of renewable electricity to supply that renewable electricity as low as possible price. The share of renewable electricity in Sweden over these 15 years has increased from about 50% in 1995 to 70% so far this year. And the cost to the consumers for this increase in renewable electricity is less than 1/10 of the cost of the German consumers. But as Felix mentioned, there is one major difference. In Sweden, we have built biomass cogeneration plants and wind power plants, but in Germany, thanks to the extra payment for PV, the German consumers have made possible the industrialization of the solar PV industry and brought down the cost to all of us. So I'm not saying that what we have done in Sweden is necessarily better, definitely not better for the world, but it has been more economically efficient for us. And I would also say that when it comes to the wind power industry, the the regime with competition amongst wind power owners in Sweden has meant that we have probably achieved among the lowest cost of wind power projects in the world. Now, the Swedish investor who invests in wind power can expect to get 4 yen per kilowatt hour for the electricity and another 2 yen per kilowatt hour for the electricity certificates for wind power, which means that at the price of 6 yen per kilowatt hour, they must be able to build and operate wind power plants. And there are significant investments in wind power in Sweden at this price. So when I tell the Swedish wind power investors that in Japan you get over 20 yen per kilowatt hour for wind power, they usually start laughing and wonder, how can we earn that money? But it is an effect of competition that is important to see and also to understand what Masayoshi Son was saying this morning. Competition is a good way of bringing down costs. And when you're looking at the way the future cost of the electricity supply system in Japan is being described during these days, possibly much more important than what long-term plans you make is that you quickly manage to introduce open competition where new actors can come in and offer low-cost, effective, good services to the customers and outcompete the large companies that have for long enjoyed the privilege of monopolies and have had no incentives at all to make their operations more efficient. I could add also that one of the opportunities that have been utilized in Sweden and has also contributed to the development of renewables is that with this simple legislation for the electricity market, any producer can offer electricity to consumer and add on any other commitments that he likes. We have contracts that are very different when it comes to price. Some consumers choose to buy electricity at the spot market price every hour, plus a little extra for the trader who arranged it for him. Some people say they want a fixed price for 3 years in advance. They can get that. But also some consumers say, I only want to pay for wind power. So you must promise, as my supplier, to produce and feed into the grid as much wind power as I take out electricity on my side. And such contracts are readily available. There are contracts saying, I want only renewable electricity. And such contracts are also now in Europe monitored by public authorities to ensure that there is no cheating. already in 1996 there were private arrangements to ensure that these contracts were audited and checked, that there was no cheating, but it's now something that is done and controlled by the authorities. So opening the market is providing an opportunity for improved efficiency, but also making it possible for consumers to influence how investments are made, and importantly, for new actors to come in and invest and compete with the old. Thank you.
はい、サンキュートーマス。ドイツとは違ったアプローチで、進めてきた。
So we see that the Swedish approach is slightly different from the German approach, and especially in regard to renewable energies, we've talked about very low prices that you have been able to see. But in regard to Germany and Sweden and Japan, the common thing that we have all in common is that before you started, there was great opposition. And hearing that even you in Sweden face great opposition is very encouraging for us in Japan, because as we know, the challenges we face in Japan are considerable, and I think I'd like Mr. Takahashi to talk about this matter. Hello, my name is Hiroshi Takahashi. I'm from Fuji Research Institute. In regard to today's program, I was looking through the pamphlet and I realized that several things. One is that there are 3 panel discussions, and in regard to the panelists, I'm the only Japanese that is included as a panelist. Everyone else is from abroad. It shows you perhaps that in Europe, we're very much ahead of you on the curve, and the Asian participants are saying we have great potential. So I guess the only impression that we're left with, I think, may be that Japan is just out of the loop completely. But the theme for today's symposium is basically the reform of the electricity markets. And since I am on representing the Japanese side, unfortunately, I'm going to have to be talking about, unfortunately, Japan is very much behind the curve in comparison to other nations. So it's a little sad that I'm in this position. However, I would still like to talk a little bit about the future of the electricity market in Japan. And if I give the conclusion first, I think the Japanese system will change in the future. In other words, the current system is presented on the left. I call this a centralized closed system. And I believe that this eventually, of course, we would like this to change over as quickly as possible, but it might take about 5 years to change to the system that we see on the right-hand side, which is the decentralized open system. I've been talking about this for the past 3 years. In other words, the left-hand side system is centralized closed system, is very much completely controlled by monopolies, the current electricity companies. For a long time, Japanese society was very grateful to have this kind of very well-working system. However, people have come to realize that this system will no longer work, and we need to have this decentralized open system as is presented on the right. Here on the top-hand side, we have the supply side. We have centralized power sources. They're going to be necessary going forward as well, but in addition to that, we're going to have new kinds of decentralized power generation systems, for example, solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, many renewable energy sources will be employed in this area. And at the bottom, we have these consumers. On the left-hand side, we had consumers, and on the right-hand side, we have consumers, but the consumers are very different in nature. In the right-hand side chart, the consumers are very not passive, but very assertive. They have very great ideas, very specific ideas about what they want and how they want it and what they want to pay, etc. In other words, the relationship between the demand and supply is going to be dramatically different because there are going to be so many players with so many different ways of thinking that are going to be participating. There are going to be 2 things that are going to be even more important going forward. One is the market. We see that in the middle of the right-hand side chart. Of course, we believe that because of the increased market and the increased number of players, we're going to have increased competition. And the next important theme is a network. We've talked about transmission system operators, and this is something new for us, a new term for us. In other words, the companies that hold only the transmission service operators, and as these are the people who, the companies that hold the transmission network and operate it. They have to be very, very neutral. They have to be very open and allow their network to be accessed by all of the players. Otherwise, this new system will not work. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the decentralized open system that we need to pursue going forward. So why then do we have to go and change this system? I think it's going to be one very important theme, and it has to do with the bringing in of renewable energy sources. If we look at the situation in Japan, there's very little renewable energy sources in Japan at present. In other words, some people can say that the left-hand side chart is still workable. However, what changed all of this, of course, as you all know, is what happened on March 11th of last year. In other words, there were the rolling blackouts, the planned rolling blackouts. After the 3/11 disaster, nuclear power plants became a very, very big theme. And as a result of all of these different events, we had the rolling power blackouts. I think most of the people here are from the Kanto, General Tokyo area. So after March 11th, especially the following week or so, there were, I think, over 18,000 households that were 18 million households that were affected by these rolling power blackouts. To have such large-scale planned blackouts was unprecedented in Japan. So even though we called them planned, and they were the blackouts that you didn't know about until just immediately before they were implemented, so everybody felt very, very inconvenienced by this. Then why did these rolling blackouts occur? Of course, the simple answer is that because there was this earthquake and a nuclear power plant accident. Of course, it's not an incorrect response, however, but I think you need a deeper analysis of this. Look at this graph here. We see here at the bottom all of the power generating capacity of Tokyo Electric Power Company. We see that as a result of the huge tsunami, Fukushima power plant number 1 and 2 went under, and therefore the nuclear parts of this chart were basically incapacitated for about a month. This, therefore, led to about 28.4% of the electricity supply being stopped for a time. So even though TEPCO has a tremendous power generating capacity, having had their power generation capacity limited by a third, forced them to eventually conduct rolling blackouts. So the fundamental conclusion that everybody derived from this experience was that if we talk about energy security, energy stable supply, then we cannot have dependence on one source of energy power generation on just one area. We need to have more distributed energy. And we saw that if you have a distributed energy power supply, you could see that you would not have anything like a 30% power shortage as you would when you have so much of energy depending on just one power source, such as in this case nuclear energy. In other words, you might have a big earthquake hit some windmill farms, but they would only be one as part of the windmills that were affected. It would not affect the entire area as this nuclear power plant accident ended up doing. I think many of you have heard that, and this has to do with something that has already been discussed from the morning sessions, that Japan has very much used a regional monopoly system where different electrical power supply companies basically had free reign in their area. This is the system that was in place until now. So because of this, we have different electricity systems networks, and as a result, when Eastern Japan suffered from this power shortage as a result of this nuclear power plant accident, although there's a great deal of extra surplus energy in Western Japan, we could not use that in Eastern Japan. In other words, it shows you the vulnerabilities of this electricity network at present, which shows you that we cannot have a stable electricity supply using the current system. So what, therefore, can we do to meet such a situation? Of course, the first thing that had to be done was to reduce demand in order to meet with the reduced supply. And so a directive was issued about demand restriction. In other words, I use the word DR here. Many people use the word acronym DR and for demand response, but here we are using it for demand restriction. In other words, a directive was issued last year to surmount the reduced power supply situation by restricting demand. And here, the blue line shows you the peak. I'm sorry, this is 2010, the blue line, and the red line shows you the peak electricity demand for last year following yesterday's earthquake. So you can see that there's been a tremendous drop in demand. The biggest demand was 17.9%. And we saw that for the 2011, July, we saw an average cut of 20.7%. This has to do, of course, with the demand restriction. In other words, because there was this directive issued to restrict demand, and there were it was for companies and industries with penalties, so that you were really required to. It was not just a request. It was not a voluntary thing. You were supposed to restrict your demand. Unfortunately, we did not have as however, we were able to do this because we were able to have a cooler summer than originally forecast. Minty has done several different research surveys in the fall of last year, and we saw that many Japanese companies actually, basically sweated blood and tears to try to cut down their energy demands. I think some of you may know some of the examples that were given here. For example, offices in Tokyo, some of the lights were turned off, elevators, half were stopped. Many of you felt this directly, the results of this restriction of using electricity. And some people worked only on weekends and didn't work on weekdays. Also, for more wealthy companies, they used their power generators, or they bought power generators so they didn't have to depend on TEPCO supply. In other words, there were blood and sweat and tears kind of efforts made to be able to overcome last year's very, very difficult situation. And I think many tens of billions of yen were also invested as a way of getting over this difficult situation. So it was not simply that there was a demand restriction order issued, and everybody followed along, and the situation was easily overcome. That's not how it was. What I'm trying to say is that, is there a possibility of creating a better demand response rather than using demand restrictions? And I bring your attention to this year's summer 2012. As you remember, in the Kansai or Western Japan area, many people said we're going to have a record summer this year. It's going to be very hot. We have to therefore be well prepared. However, looking at the Kansai electric power area, we see the blue shows you the demand line for 2011 and for 2010, and the red shows you for 2012. And you can see that the Kansai people, the Western Japan people, on average, cut their peak by about 12%. Compared to 2010, this year, apparently the summer was slightly cooler, but it was hotter than last year's summer. In spite of this, however, the people in the Kansai, in a similar way to the Tokyo people, were able to reduce their peak use considerably. And as a result, we did not have to actually implement rolling power blackouts in the Western Japan area. They were prepared to do so, but they did not have to do so. In other words, what I'm saying is that learning from the experiences of what happened in Tokyo in 2011, the people in Western Japan area, Kansai area, were smarter about holding down their electricity demand this year. In other words, there was good enlightenment work. In other words, good publicity done in advance so that people were prepared to do things. So putting aside the current debate as to whether there did have to be the restarting of one of the nuclear power plants that had been stopped, the OE power plant or not, putting that aside for a moment, I think what we can say is that there was perhaps more of a power supply than people had originally expected. So what am I trying to say here? One is that in regard to providing a stable supply of electricity, we must better use the network. In other words, not only trying to balance supply and demand in just a local area, but also be able to share electricity where necessary between large, vast regions. Now, that is the more efficient way of using electricity, and also making better use of the markets. If electricity prices go up, people will conserve energy. If you are able to peak cut, in other words, reduce your peak usage, then you'll be able to get a little bit of extra money. So that is the kind of incentive that has helped, and it has resulted in a new deliberative committee under the auspices of METI, which is trying to. It started out in February, and I'm one of the members of this committee. We're trying to think about the unbundling of security of power generation, etc. But we're talking about the future of electricity usage, and we put out a basic guideline or directive, and I've taken the main points and shown them here. There are three major points. One is full market liberalization. I think you are very well aware of this, and this is especially for the retail sector as well. Right now, the households are not able to choose their providers, so we want to make it 100% liberalized so that even individual households can choose where to purchase their electricity from. Secondly, the unbundling of the transmission grid, which has been a major theme throughout the day. It says operational unbundling or legal unbundling, but even before that, we need functional unbundling as well, not only the legal unbundling, but the functional unbundling as well. And also we need to have wide area system operators and coordinators. That's the way we want to be able to operate the new grids. And third point, so are we going to have enough competition simply by liberalizing the markets and unbundling the grids? No, I think we need to have re-regulation, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, and we also need to have other ways to increase competition. Until now, electricity companies basically had 100% monopoly, so of course they're strong. So we cannot have a level playing field unless the new players are given some kind of advantage. And from the fall, we're going to start up this deliberative committee again, and so we're going to come up with more specific policies in this regard. That is the general schedule. So I hope you will have great expectations for our work. So if I can summarize today's speech. First of all, we had Mr. Furukawa's speech. We're moving from nuclear power to green technologies. But this is not just simply nuclear power. We're going to recycle renewable energy. This is something I would like very much to stress. Not just the source of energy is changing, but what's important is that we want to better use the network in order to create a better balance between supply and demand. And also, I think very much we should have market capitalism very much inside this energy sector, not what has been done in the past, which is major players coordinating with the government to ensure a stable electricity supply. In other words, to have a system where the operator says, we will take care of everyone, nobody has to worry about this at all. But rather, we have to have many different kinds of possibilities so that consumers will be able to choose the kind of demand response that they want. So in other words, not simply changing the sources of electricity power generation, but also changing the system by which this new electricity is used. And I think we already have heard from, for example, a speaker in Germany that many of the countries more advanced than us are moving to the next phase We in Japan are very much behind the curve, but again, we are following very fast on the tracks of Germany and other nations to try to catch up. In other words, we believe that in the future for us, the way that we can make our revolution successful is to have the participation and support of the people. Thank you very, very much.
はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Dr. Takahashi. And we have spoken from our experience of the earthquake, and we have seen the utilization or the advantage of utilizing the network, and that we see that we have to look for some changes in the market. And so I think we have 25 minutes remaining from this discussion time. And so I'd like to invite some questions from the floor as well. But before we get to that, in Japan, we have just embarked on the utilization of the renewable energies. And so we are still way behind Sweden and Germany in terms of the introduction of renewable energies. And so we have regions which have now fully opened, whereas we are still not there yet. Now, I understand that there have been some cases in Europe where this had not been very successful either. But maybe you can give us some examples of what we should not do, since we are latecomer to this idea. Can we have your views on to what we should not be doing as we introduce the renewables in Japan? And to that, I would like to ask Dr. Takahashi to respond to those two proposals.
Important advice to anyone who's trying to re-regulate an electricity market is avoid unnecessary complications. I'm quite sure that the power companies in this country will have strong arguments that there should be special privileges to some companies that have made large investments in large power plants that might not be profitable under competitive conditions, that they need special privileges to manage nuclear waste or nuclear accident residues. But try to keep such special arguments outside of the electricity market. It will have to be solved by taxpayers, probably, or by the owners of the power companies. But it's not something that should influence the competition between. There should not be a reason for privileges in competition with new power producers. So keep it as simple and transparent and understandable as possible. This is also extremely valuable to attract new investors into the electricity system. Investors who cannot understand how the market works will not dare to invest. So keep it simple.
Thank you. Now, Felix.
Yeah, I think there is a couple of points, and especially because there are so many similarities between my home country and your country. I think my country, as well as your country, has the tendency to go for negotiated regimes. And we tried this for half a decade, and we ended in an absolute mess, because the asymmetry between the regulator and the policymaker and the industry with huge vested interests creates many complications. And that means a clear differentiation of roles. Who is the regulator and who is the regulated is one of the key issues. Without, as long as you have a mixture between these kind of interests, it will be very, very difficult. The second is, what you need is confidence. And for confidence, you need a clear vision where you have to go. And I think we have a series of bad experiences in the European Union and also in other countries. If you go for these transitional aspects on a campaign base, that means for the next 5 years, the issue number A is in the focus, and 5 years later, the issue number B is in the focus. You need a more clear vision to build confidence. The third issue is that you will always have to fight against the vested interests. These interests are there. And there are only two answers. The first I gave you, this is a clear separation of roles. And the second is to attract new players and to break let's say, the monopolies for certain activities. My colleague from Germany has shown you in the first session the structure of investments in the German power sector. And we had a monopolized market since 1935 until 1998. And in these 60 years, all the investments in the power sector have been made by the traditional utilities. What has changed over the course of the last 20 years, that in between 50% of the investments in the power sector does not longer come from the usual suspects. And that has two dimensions. The first is there is a business for private people, but also for industrial companies who build their cogeneration plants, etc., etc. And the second is that you acquire new sources of financing. I just had a couple of weeks ago a visit from representatives of a big bank with the expensive suit, and they became very nervous about the financing structures in the German power market, because 50% is not longer made by the big financing from Goldman Sachs or whatever, but by the local banks, because these are limited investments from new players. And I think the issue is how to attract new investors or to widen the portfolio of new investors. And the last point is to think about structures which are focusing solutions and not the problems. If you look to many papers issued by the network operators in the period where they were not unbundled, you can find a lot of papers, what are the problems of wind integration? And I have also a long list of problems. The key issue is that you need economic entities or companies who are interested into the solutions. And that is the mindset. And my theory here is that the redirection of the focus from problems to solutions depends on institutional arrangements. And the institutional arrangements are therefore key. And you will never be able to end with this in negotiations, because, and that's my last remark, economic activity is driven by economic interest. I've shown you the big north-south lines for Germany. You could ask the question, these issues have been known for 10 years. Why nobody made these investments? It's very clear, because the generators in the south had no interest to be subject of redispatch measures, which are partly a result of feed-in from wind energy. And so they had simply no interest to build the north-south lines. And the interest was created after this unbundling of interests materialized, and that a company realized that the only way to make business is to make investment in solutions. And so the institutional arrangements for changing the focus to solutions are important. And in my country, we wasted probably 10 years by hoping to solve these problems and to bypass the economic interests by by negotiations and voluntary agreements, etc., etc.
はい。
はい、ありがとうございます。今お二人のお話いろいろ
Well, thank you very much. I think there was a lot that we could learn from the two speakers' advices. And I think what has been pointed out is that we need to see newcomers into the industry. And we have a very monopolized environment with very little competition. But it's important that new entrants come into the market and create a competition, and that is probably the most rational and the quickest way of bringing about changes. And I think I agree with you wholeheartedly as to what you have mentioned. That has happened in the area of telecommunications. We had a monopoly providing telephone service in Japan, but with the competition introduction, and there have been competition. And I'm not saying this just because we have Mr. Son here from the telecommunication carrier. But the fact that we have seen this competition, we are seeing that the improvement in the service level has really benefited the people. So similarly, in the power industry, it's if we could generate more competition in Japan with newcomers to the industry, maybe we could have a more open environment as has been experienced in Europe. So is it in fact possible in Japan? And I have always wondered as a Japanese whether this could be realized in Japan. Now I have given a lot of thought to this, but I do agree that it's very difficult. Now for the renewables, we now have the feed-in tariff mechanism, and so SoftBank, which has never been in the industry of power generation, but now we are finding they're in this, and we have convenience stores and the agricultural cooperatives and the municipalities, which are in fact entering into the power generation industry. And the fact that we have these new entries is going to invigorate the power industry, and we're hoping that this will bring about changes in a better direction. And so what do we need to bring this about? First of all, we need to see changes in our policies, which means that it will be up to the decision making by the politicians and also the bureaucrats. So we need to see change in the policy, first of all. And secondly, what's important is that we, the consumers, must demand it. So we, as consumers, must question why there is a monopoly, why we are not able to choose our own supplier of power utility, that we want to be able to choose our menu of how we pay for our power. So it's important that the consumers raise their voices, and then the industry will have to listen to these voices. And if they don't, then the government will have to do something to make the industry listen to the voices of the consumers. And so in Japan, we have been looking at we have not been looking at the power generation mechanism. We have not been interested that much in the past, but we now should be demanding more alternatives, more choice. Thank you very much.
チャンスで
Now we are facing the historical opportunity. More than anybody else, Japanese people have raised the literacy for the nuclear power station, as well as the renewables. And this is the opportunity for changing policies and attitudes.
You started mentioning who would be the winners and the losers of such a reform. And I would like to just, based on the experience from Europe, describe how the opinion around this will develop. I think that there are already many individual consumers who understand that it would be beneficial to them with a re-regulation and introduction of competition. And of course, the large monopoly electric power companies are today generally against. There are companies who are potential providers of equipment for the new renewable energy installations that would increase in the future, who realize that it is much more profitable for them to supply equipment to a new electricity system than to maintain the old power stations and system that exists. So they will, one by one, become quite enthusiastic about re-regulation. Then there are many industrial electricity customers who are fundamentally interested in low electricity prices and thereby in a competitive electricity market where they can choose suppliers. Some of the very largest electricity consumers will sit behind closed doors together with representatives from the large electric power companies, and when the industrial consumers say that they might favor competition, the large power companies will offer these few large power companies very cheap electricity if they promise to support them in the political battle. And when this is understood, a lot of small consumers will be very upset and more strongly in favor of competition. And then the large electricity consumers will be more show solidarity with all other industries and say that maybe we also think competition is good. And then in the end, there are only the large electric power companies who are against. And then you will ask the large electric power companies, who will actually lose from competition? Well, it's only these who know that they are inefficient and unable to compete. And when that argument has been used against the large electric power companies for a while, at least their managing directors who like to believe that they are very efficient and well organized and that they should be able to compete with anyone else, they will also agree. Even if in fact they will not be able to compete, they will often like to believe that they can. And then you will have everyone in favor and the reform will be brought about. It took 3 years in Sweden. Maybe it can go much faster here, as you know what will happen.
Thank you. あと、
Thank you. I have 7 minutes 40 seconds left, so I'd like to entertain some questions from the floor. And could you identify who you would like to address your question and identify yourself first, please? Microphone, please.
Come to the front then, because
okay.
we need for the translation.
or you can stand on front.
Yeah.
So you can stand on that, or either or. Okay, you can get mic.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. Yeah, I have heard about the power system reform in, Sweden and in Japan. That plan is beautiful. Actually, trend is good. But the question about that is electricity cost. So a lot of persons concerned about electric cost at the state of a market system. So how do you set, or how do you, control the reasonable electricity cost compared to with the, customer price? Because usually the government is concerned about the increase of customer prices. So maybe electricity cost is the basic price to control other customer product. So I think maybe you can have some kind of experience. At the, steady state, it's okay, but the problem is something happened at the emergency side or some other occasion, there is a big surge, a big increase. In that case, how do you set that kind of system? And the second question is to Mr. Takahashi. And you mentioned several strategies to save, the saving electricity. So number 3 is the production shift in case of a factory. So at the peak time around maybe afternoon, and either to make the ship in the factory in production. So usually the company has suggested to operate their system weekend or nighttime. In that case, then the factory might have some kind of, loss about some extra cost of the manpower or some other things. So who is paying that kind of the money? The government or just the company who is make the power shift?
Okay, Thomas and Takashi-san.
Well, the experience of price development in Sweden and the Nordic countries was that when competition was introduced, prices fell dramatically. They also evened out so that small consumers got electricity at the same level as some of the previously privileged large industrial consumers, because the competition meant that everyone wanted to make maximum profit. The electricity price then rose, and when it fell to 1 yen per kilowatt hour. That's low. It then increased to 5-6 yen per kilowatt hour a year ago, and now it's fallen. So now the price for the coming year or two, if that's what you buy, is about 4 yen per kilowatt hour in the Nordic Nord Pool. You can go in and check at the Nord Pool with 2 O, spot.com at any time. So we're not at all worried that prices become high because of competition. They become low. The adjustment to extreme cases, such as a very dry year in the hydropower system or nuclear reactors that suddenly stops functioning, it results in increased electricity prices and a little bit lower consumption, because when prices increase, demand decrease. And that is the beautiful mechanism of the market, and we have no price restrictions at all, which is very important. In California, in the US, they had this sort of semi-competitive situation where they had regulated end-user prices and no regulation of supply prices before that. And of course that was misused by some people to earn a lot of money whilst others lost. So no price restriction is a very important fundamental if the market is to work. And then you have the mechanism that one of our ministers tried to describe in public when he said, it was regarding the food market, where he said that in my experience the best way to avoid high food prices is high food prices. And it's the same in the electricity market. If electricity market gets high, people will invest in electricity production and prices will fall. That's how the market should work, and that is how it works in practice. So avoid any restrictions on pricing and make sure that there's free access to invest. Then prices will be kept at a reasonable level.
Okay. じゃあ、高橋さん。
はい。
手短
Concerning the tariff, if I may make a comment, it's often said that the Japanese electricity tariff in the past 15 years have come down, and it's about the same level as in the European countries. So this is deregulation a la japonaise, but this is not fact. I would like to confirm that. The Japanese electricity tariff, there's quite a lot of add-on in terms of taxes. So 40% is taxes in Germany, perhaps. So therefore, Japanese electricity rates may look low, but there's only less than 10% taxes in there. So therefore, the actual net cost of electricity in Japan is still rather high. So therefore, if competition is introduced in Japan, I do believe there is still room for the cost cutting in Japan. And also, we can do some peak shifting. And who pays the cost there? In essence, it is the users, whether we are talking about corporations or whether we are talking about changing from ordinary light bulbs to LEDs. That's all the cost for the companies, and they would have to pay extra wages to the employees to work on weekends rather than on a weekday. So the additional labor cost would have to be footed by the companies. So last year, in the summertime, there was the ordinance to restrict the amount of electricity usage, and that was enacted by the government. So it was part of the law of this land. So therefore, companies had to follow those rules. But there was some subsidy given to cogeneration plants. And so, in essence, the users must make an effort to conserve energy. Some people might say that it's too much, but of course, for last summer, there had to be a conservation of about 15% in energy. And coming into this year, and users and consumers tried their best to conserve energy, and people were saying that they didn't do much, but they were able to cut down on the electricity bill that they paid. So last year, it was mandatory that companies and users decrease the amount of electricity consumed. But this year, there was no obligation. It was a request from the government and from the electricity power companies that users cut down on their electricity usage. And then people found out that they could somehow survive the hot summer despite this reduction, voluntary reduction in their electricity. And I think everyone has understood that, and that's a very big lesson that we have learned. Last year, I think there was a lot of frustration felt that this was an obligation, a mandatory sort of pressure from the government to cut down on electricity. But this year, it was more a voluntary effort. And so try to reduce demand, sort of shift the demand, postpone the demand at later hours. Thank you. Philippe.
Make two comments on the prices. I think you have to be very frank, and you have to ask what are the alternatives. The alternatives are either regulated prices or prices which will result from competition. And regulated prices are always negotiated prices. And the more dynamic the economic environment is, the more difficult the negotiation is. In the continental European power market, the prices depend on gas prices, coal prices, CO2 prices, etc. These have been very volatile. And in these negotiations, you have two possible outcomes. Either the industry wins in the negotiations, then they make an extra profit, and the ratepayer pays. Or the government wins and the utility runs into problem with investments, etc., etc. And what they will do after this negotiation is to ask for subsidies for investments. And again, the taxpayers, this time the taxpayers pays. So the option to choose your supplier is the most healthy limit to price increases in a very dynamic environment. But there's another aspect, and I would like to highlight this because it's a political aspect. If the consumers, and that means the private households as the industry, as the service sector, has the choice to choose his supplier, then he will have a look on the behavior of the supplier. I give you a small example. Berlin is supplied by the former monopoly Vattenfall, the Swedish company. And they had the two worst managed nuclear power stations in Germany. Every year an incident. And after liberalization, and we had the third year with the annual incident, Vattenfall in Berlin and Hamburg have lose 20% of their customers because the customers were not longer ready to accept the supplier who manages nuclear power stations in that way. And that has been one of the drivers behind even the nuclear phase-out decision in Germany, because the voters and the taxpayers and the ratepayers have made also their own choice that they didn't want to have, number one, these suppliers, and number two, they had an alternative. And I think this freedom of choice, which reflects prices, competition will not always lead to lower prices, but in a dynamic environment, it will lead to the lowest possible prices. And on the other hand, it will put a focus on the behavior of the companies. And the companies have to think about that the reaction of the consumer will be there. And this is a strong argument on the institutional and the political arrangement if it comes to high-risk strategies or to longer-term sustainable strategies, etc., etc.
Thank you. 時間が来てしまいましたので、質問一つだけになりましたけども、これでこのセッション。
I think the time has come to end our session, and taking into account what was said by the three speakers and by the questions, we weren't able to really go beyond 2030, but as Mr. Takahashi said, so from the experience of 311 of last year, and we have to improve both network as well as the market that will be born from now on. And in the process, we can take into account the experience of both Sweden and Germany. And I think it's essential that we be as simple as possible, whether you're talking about the system itself or how we operate that system. We have to be as simple as is possible. And I think the driver for that is, as Mr. Takahashi mentioned, it has to be policy. We have to change the politics of this country. And we ourselves, as consumers, as users, must move towards change. We have to say that we want a transparent market, and of course we want reasonable prices for the renewables that are available in the market. And I think we have to demand those from the government. And I think these were the messages from the three speakers. And I would like to ask the audience for a warm round of applause to the three speakers. Thank you very much. And let's provide the speakers, as well as Mr. Ida, with a very warm round of applause. Then let us take a 20-minute break from now. And please return at 4 o'clock when the roundtable discussion will start. So if you don't have the materials, please do refer to the JREF homepage later on. And I hope that you will fill in the questionnaire and return that to the Secretariat. And please also return the simultaneous interpretation receivers when you leave the room. And also reports are available for the conference that was held in March.